When I first got my hands on the Mavic Mini 2, I was compelled to compare it against the Mavic Air 2 and the Mavic Pro 2. All the while I knew that the camera specs and the flight specs and the side-by-side comparison information would say that the Mavic Mini 2 is the inferior drone, but I was actually quite surprised by what this little thing can do. Look, I'm not going to say that the Mavic Mini 2 is the best drone that you can get. My personal opinion is that right off the bat, the Air 2 is the better drone, especially for first-time flyers. Now, I know that that's a controversial statement because most people would advise you to spend less money on your first drone, but I think the biggest surprise when I unboxed the Mavic Mini 2 was that it has absolutely no obstacle avoidance whatsoever. And for first-time drone flyers, there's a high level of anxiety when you first start flying. You don't want to crash this expensive thing that you just bought, or borrowed in my case. And if you do crash, hopefully you purchase the DJI Care refresh so that it doesn't cost too much to fix. In my opinion, the Mavic Mini 2 is perhaps a better option for a more experienced drone pilot who's looking for a really lightweight setup. The omission of obstacle avoidance on this drone really sets the stage for disaster. Okay, maybe I'm just projecting a little bit because when I first got a drone, I crashed it a few times and thankfully it was able to be easily repaired at home. But just having the peace of mind when I'm flying the Air 2, knowing that if I come a little bit too close to a tree or a little bit too close to a building in the city, the drone will protect itself. It's important for me to convey these feelings to you before we jump in and talk about this new drone. Look, I want you to buy this drone or anything else that I talk about in these videos, and so does every other YouTuber who talks about it. Mavic Mini 2 is a capable 4K drone. It's moderately priced and it has pretty good specs, and if you fly extra carefully, you're probably going to be just fine. So with all that in mind, let's actually compare DJI's 3 flagship drones against each other. And let's start with the cameras. The Air 2 has a 48 megapixel camera and the Mavic 2 Pro has a 20 megapixel camera. The Mini 2 has a 12 megapixel camera. The Mini 2 has the smallest sensor and the Pro 2 has the largest sensor. The differences in the sensor sizes will become very apparent when you start shooting in lower light conditions. The Air 2 and the Mini 2 both have a fixed aperture of f2.8, while the Mavic 2 Pro has a variable aperture from f2.8 to f11. The variability on the Mavic 2 Pro means that you don't always have to use an ND filter because you can increase the aperture to compensate for brighter conditions. It also means that you have more control over your depth of field and overall sharpness to your photos and video. The Air 2 and the Mini 2 both have a 24mm equivalent focal length, whereas the 2 Pro has 28mm, so it's a little bit tighter. In terms of video specs, all 3 of these drones are going to give you 4K 24 frames per second, and 25 frames and 30 frames per second. The Air 2 will actually give you 4K up to 60 frames per second, but you'll have to step down to 2.7K on the Pro 2 in order to get that same 60 frames. And on the Mini 2, you'll have to go all the way down to 1080 in order to get that 60 frames per second. Now, if you go down to 1080 on the Air 2 and the Pro 2, you'll have up to 120 frames per second and even 240 frames per second on the Air 2. In terms of video quality, the Pro 2 is going to give you 10-bit log and HDR video up to 100 megabits per second. You won't have log on the Air 2, but you do have an increase in the bitrate to up to 120 megabits per second, which will definitely help with color correction, especially when you film in the D-Cinelec color profile. Now, the Mini 2 doesn't give you any picture profile options, but it does record at 100 megabits per second, so at least you have that. Unlike the Mini 2, both the Air 2 and the Pro 2 give you HDR video up to 30 frames per second. Unfortunately, in both of these drones, you'll have to shoot in auto mode for HDR video. But DJI's HDR mode is actually pretty darn good. In terms of flying characteristics, the first thing I noticed when I started flying the Mini 2 was that even though wind resistance is rated the same in both the Air 2 and the Mini, with 10-mile-an-hour winds, it was really difficult to get the drone hovering in one spot without drifting. There were even some scary moments while flying where I wasn't actually quite sure that the Air 2 was going to make it all the way back to my takeoff spot through the wind. At full throttle, I really wasn't making too much headway through it, but once I switched it into sport mode, I was able to cut through and make it back. I also had a couple situations where it was clear that the wind gusts were jostling the Mini 2 around in the air. So with all that said, if you can hold out and save up a few more bucks for the Mavic Air 2, I would highly recommend that strategy. But if you appreciate the smaller form factor and the lower price, and as long as you're flying safely and keeping enough distance between your drone and the things around you, you'll definitely be happy with it. All right, that's my 2 cents in this conversation. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. It's small actions like that that help creators like me who don't have a huge following rank up in the search results to compete against channels with millions of subscribers. All right, I'll see you in the next video.